Hello, uh, I'm Dan Scott, and this is the third in a series of coping with change. And today I want to talk about the pre-modern world. Now, in my last session, I talked about how that we tend to divide the history of the Western world into three main categories. At least philosophers do that. And the first category is the pre-modern world, and then there's the modern world, and now we're in the postmodern world. But it's challenging to understand what the postmodern world is about without understanding the modern world and the pre-modern world, because these are both reactions to something that came earlier, what we call the classical period. So when you study, say, the classical philosophers, then you're talking about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and all the philosophers of that period of the ancient Greco and Roman period. It's a vast section of time, several centuries. But anyway, we can think about pre-modern. The pre-modern world is the world up to 1500. Now, pre-modern peoples themselves didn't give themselves that label. We gave it to them. And we gave it to them so that we can understand how to distinguish how they thought. If you want to know why we categorize these periods in this way, here is a kind of a rule of thumb. Pre-modern, modern, and postmodern describe how the majority of the people in the Western world experienced and explained reality. When you are in the middle of one of these periods, you just think what's real is real and it doesn't need explaining. But in times of change, as we are in now, then it becomes evident that much of what we believe to be real is constructed, mentally constructed. The pre-modern world, let's say that the operative word that describes that world is synergy. Everything is a vast system, a web of being, sometimes called the great chain of being. God is at the center, and God makes sure everything works as it should. Everything is contained in everything else. There's parts of this world that are seen, parts of this world that are unseen. So we have angels and demons and all kinds of forces of nature, and these all have names. And depending on whether one was a Christian or a Stoic or whatever other religious or mystical view that one had, it would be they would have different names and categorize things a little differently. But in general, we can say they all shared this view that reality is an integrated whole. Everything is contained in the parts in the pre-modern world. As William Blake said, that to see the world in a grain of sand. Much like a hologram. If you're familiar with holograms, if you destroy a holographic plate, every piece of that plate contains the picture of the whole. It's just a little less clear. So you can reproduce the whole if you have one of the parts, because all the information of the whole is contained in the parts. That is the way that the pre-modern world viewed reality. Everything had its place and derived its meaning from its place in this great chain of being. Human beings, even, they were assigned particular roles that they played, and you were born into a certain segment of society, and you played your role well, and you were respectful if you played your part well, as God intended you to play. It's a world of paradox in a way, because it's a non-literary world. Very few people could read and write, but for that reason, literature was very highly esteemed, even worshipped. So a library would contain, a huge library would contain a few hundred volumes. That would be a handful of ancient libraries. The library at Alexandria, Egypt, was the greatest library of all. And it contained, or tried to contain, a copy of everything that had been written up to that period. But most libraries were a few dozen books, and very few individuals owned books. Mostly it was scrolls for a long time. Then they learned to chop the scrolls into pieces and weave them together to create what we now know is the book, and that was a great step forward in knowing and in preserving text. How was text preserved mostly? People memorized text. There were people that memorized the Bible. There were people that memorized all kinds of ancient texts. And they had ways of doing that. They were taught a discipline called mnemonics in school that taught people how to memorize things by coding it in a kind of a palace and a system. So public buildings were constructed for this purpose, and one could walk through a building and then memorize all the building in your head where everything is. Then you could put text in your head as you read it. You went to a library to read a text and to memorize a text. That's why text was often had these fantastic pictures around it. As you know, in the illuminated manuscripts, we call them, of the Bible, there were all these beautiful artistic depictions of things. Sometimes it wasn't even about the scene being spoken of in the text, but those scenes are there to memorize the text. There's a great scholar by the name of Mary Carruthers that's written extensively on this, and her most famous book is called The Book of Memory. It's a marvel of a book, and her second book is called The Craft of Thought. And between these two books, she shows how the pre-modern world memorized text. And they had all kinds of ways for storing information in their minds. For example, she definitively, I think, proves that the zodiac was a navigation system more than a fortune-telling device. So if you knew, what stars were positioned in what times of the year and what place, you could find your way around. The pre-modern world was a highly developed technological world. We don't think of it that way, but in the late 60s, I believe I'm right about that date, should have checked it, you can check it, there was a device that was found in a sunken ship near Crete, and it was called the Anchises mechanism. And this mechanism, its purpose was unknown. It had all kinds of gears and levers, and it was only just a few years ago, with the advent of the kind of technology we have now to look inside mechanisms and figure things out, it was decided that this was a navigation device that was in a real sense a analog computer that one turned with a crank, and it took the tides, the times of the tides, the position of the moon, the position of stars, and several other kinds of data, and it would put them together and give the navigator his position, or I guess there might have been women navigators, her position, but they used this mechanism to know where they were going. There were steam engines at the end of the Byzantine Empire. There were all kinds of inventions, but of course that civilization collapsed, and we'll talk about that later on, why that was so, because it has bearing on how we react to change. Well, I better wrap this one up. The pre-modern world it continued to exist in many ways in the Celtic countries, in the Appalachians, and in the United States, because the pre-modern world only ended right about 1500. But when we say it ended, it doesn't mean suddenly everybody that's been in that world stops thinking in that way. This goes on another 150, 200 years sometimes in isolated communities, and there's a lot of overlap between these eras. That's what causes contention and confusion between peoples, and trying to figure out if their neighbors are nuts, or instead of knowing that they're really coming at reality in a very different way. Anyway, the pre-modern world was a world of artistry. I would say that was more centered in right brain function than left brain function. It approached things from the standpoint of synergy and systems, and individual things and individual people were much less important. Even until modern times, in most countries, if you sent a letter somewhere, you started with the country, then the city, then the area of the city, the person's last name, then the person's first name. The very opposite of the way we now send our letters. And the reason for that was you think systems first and then you come down. The modern world reversed that order, as we will see in our next talk about the modern world. But anyway, that's the pre-modern world. There is much in Christian faith that embodies pre-modern thinking, and that's not a pejorative statement. It's not an insult. I think it's a wonderful statement. C.S. Lewis said, "There was a day, by the grace of God, I ceased being a modern man." Everything about the modern world was not good. Everything about the pre-modern world was not good. But they have good and bad, and they have features that we probably relate to, each of them, in different ways, and we'll talk about that. And then finally, of course, our aim is in 2 or 3 sessions to get to what is the postmodern world that we're in now, and why are people seeing reality so differently than they've seen it before. So that's the pre-modern world. Thank you for joining in for this nerdy moment. If you have any comments, I would love to chat with you. And I'll be having a website before too long, and we'll be able to carry on that conversation. And also, all of this is contained in a book that I've written called Christianity Through the Looking Glass, and it will be available in a few months. Thank you for tuning in.